You're listening to Tales of Vatican Secrets, and if you're settling in right now, wherever you are in the world, I want you to know something. This isn't going to be one of those stories that dances around the edges. Tonight, we're going into the actual mechanics of silence, the catalog codes, the shelf restrictions, the physical systems that keep certain documents out of reach. If you enjoy these late-night investigations into what's real and documented, go ahead and subscribe. I'd love to know which country you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now, because over the next hour and a half, we're going to walk through something specific, the archival classification system that creates a category of material no researcher can formally request, even if they know it exists. You're standing in your mind outside the entrance to the Vatican Secret Archives, formerly renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archive in 2019. Though the older name still clings to it in most conversations, and you're trying to understand something that doesn't make immediate sense. The building itself, attached to the Cortile del Belvedere, doesn't look like a fortress. It looks like administrative space, the kind of place where bureaucrats might spend their afternoons filing paperwork and drinking espresso. But when you step past the threshold as an accredited researcher, which requires weeks of formal application, institutional affiliation, and a specific topic of inquiry submitted in writing, you begin to notice the way the system itself has been designed not just to organize material, but to control the questions you're allowed to ask. The modern archive, as it functions today, holds approximately 53 miles of shelving, and that number gets cited so often it's almost lost its meaning. But when you actually try to visualize 53 linear miles of documents, manuscripts, ledgers, and correspondence stacked in climate-controlled rooms beneath and around the Vatican palaces, you start to understand the physical reality of what silence looks like when it's systematized. The catalogs you're given access to as a researcher are detailed, but they're not complete. There are sections, specific classification codes, that appear in internal finding aids, but not in the materials made available to outside scholars, and this isn't an accident of disorganization. It's a structure that was refined over centuries, formalized in particular during the late 19th century under Pope Leo XIII, who in 1881 opened portions of the archive to scholars for the first time, but did so with a very deliberate set of limitations. Leo XIII's reform is often celebrated as a moment of transparency, and in many ways it was. Historians could suddenly access medieval papal correspondence, financial records from the Renaissance, diplomatic exchanges that had been sealed for generations. But what's less discussed, and what you only discover when you spend time reading the correspondence of archivists from that period, is that the opening came with a simultaneous reorganization of classification systems that moved certain materials into categories that were excluded from the new access permissions. This wasn't hidden in some melodramatic sense. There were no secret meetings in candlelit chambers, but it was institutional, procedural, and therefore almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. One of the people who did know what to look for was a Jesuit historian named Franz Erle, who served as prefect of the Vatican Library and had direct oversight of the archive's reorganization in the 1880s and 1890s. Erle understood that opening the archive meant creating a system that could appear open while maintaining control over sensitive material, and he developed a cataloging method that used coded shelf references, specific combinations of letters and numbers that didn't appear in the public indexes. These codes, often beginning with the prefix AA for Archivio Arcano, or variations like RIS for Riservato, indicated materials that were considered too sensitive for general scholarly access, not because they contained theological heresies or scandalous secrets in the popular sense, but because they documented the internal decision-making processes of the papacy in ways that could be used to challenge the Church's institutional authority. You're not dealing with ancient mysteries here. You're dealing with something much more concrete, the bureaucratic logic of an institution that realized, at the end of the 19th century, that it needed to manage its own history in order to survive the modern world. The physical reality of this system becomes clear when you understand how the shelving itself was organized. The main archive storage areas are divided into multiple sections: Archivio Segreto, Vaticano proper, the Fondo Borghese, the Archivio Consistoriale, and dozens of smaller fonds and collections. But within these larger divisions, there are subsections that don't appear on the maps given to researchers. Some of these are simply storage rooms for materials that haven't been fully cataloged yet, which is a legitimate archival problem when you're dealing with centuries of accumulated documentation. But others are deliberate separations, rooms or shelf ranges that contain materials classified under the reserved codes. One historian, working in the archive in the 1970s, described noticing that the numerical sequence of shelf markers in one section of the Archivio Consistoriale skipped from AC 1147 to AC 1149, with no AC 1148 visible. When he asked the attending archivist about the missing number, he was told it was a cataloging error from an earlier period. But later, in a private conversation with a Vatican librarian he'd befriended, he learned that AC 1148 existed, but contained correspondence related to papal negotiations during the Italian unification period that were still considered too politically sensitive to release, even a century later. The consequence of this system is that historians working on topics related to the Risorgimento, the process of Italian unification in the 1860s and 1870s, have access to enormous amounts of documentation, letters, financial records, diplomatic reports. But there are specific gaps, moments where the correspondence suddenly becomes vague or where key figures stop appearing in the record. And these gaps correspond to moments when the papacy was making decisions that would later become controversial. You can trace this pattern across multiple pontificates, but it's particularly visible during the reign of Pius IX, who ruled from 1846 to 1878 and oversaw the loss of the Papal States to the Kingdom of Italy. Pius IX's correspondence is heavily documented in the archive, and much of it has been available to scholars since the early 20th century. But there are specific files related to his negotiations with Italian officials, his communications with Catholic monarchs in Europe, and his internal discussions about how to respond to the collapse of temporal papal power that remain classified under reserved codes. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this material would actually be as revealing as the restrictions suggest, or whether the classification is partly a matter of institutional habit, a continuation of categories that were created in the 1880s and never formally reviewed. But the fact that the disagreement exists tells you something important. The restriction itself has become part of the historical record, shaping what can and cannot be said about this period. When you're sitting in the reading room of the Vatican Archive, which is a surprisingly ordinary space with wooden desks, reading lamps, and a staff of attendants who bring you requested materials on carts, you're not experiencing dramatic secrecy. You're experiencing something more subtle and more effective, which is the feeling that you have access to almost everything, which makes the gaps harder to identify and even harder to challenge. The Vatican Archives regulations, updated most recently in 2017 and again after the 2019 renaming, specify that materials are generally available up to the end of the pontificate of Pius V, who died in 1939, with more recent materials requiring special permission. But even within the pre-1939 materials, there are documents that fall under permanent restrictions, and these are coded in ways that don't always appear in the request system. If you're a researcher working on, say, the Vatican's diplomatic relations with France during the reign of Leo XIII, you can request hundreds of files, and most of them will be delivered to you within a day or two. But if your research touches on the Vatican's internal discussions about French anti-clericalism or the process by which certain French bishops were selected or removed, you'll find that some file numbers referenced in secondary literature or in other documents simply don't appear in the catalog you're able to search. This isn't because they've been destroyed, archival records suggest they're still physically present, but because they've been classified in a way that places them outside the standard request system. You're beginning to understand that the restriction system isn't a single decision made at one moment in history, but a layered process that evolved across different pontificates, each adding its own logic to what should and shouldn't be accessible. One of the most significant layers was added during the reign of Pius X, who served as pope from 1903 to 1914, and is remembered primarily for his conservative theological positions and his campaign against modernism within the Catholic Church. Pius X issued the decree Lamentabili Sane Exitu in 1907, condemning 65 propositions associated with modernist theology, and followed it with the encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis, which described modernism as the synthesis of all heresies and established a system of oversight to identify and remove modernist influences from Catholic institutions. What's less discussed is that this campaign included an archival component. Pius X ordered a review of materials in the Vatican archive that related to theological controversies from previous centuries and materials that documented the Church's internal debates about doctrinal development, scriptural interpretation, or the relationship between faith and historical scholarship were reclassified under restricted codes. The logic was straightforward from an institutional perspective. If the Church was fighting a battle against modernist interpretations of doctrine, it couldn't simultaneously make available archival materials that showed how much internal disagreement had existed in previous eras about similar questions. The physical mechanism for this reclassification involved the creation of a new series of shelf codes, primarily using the prefix RV for Riservato Vaticano, which indicated materials that required explicit papal permission to access. Some historians estimate that several thousand documents were moved into RV classifications during the Pius X period, though the exact number isn't publicly documented. One category that was heavily affected involved correspondence between Rome and various national Catholic hierarchies during the 19th century, particularly letters discussing how local bishops should respond to new developments in historical scholarship, archaeology, and biblical criticism. These letters show a papacy that was often uncertain about how to respond to academic challenges, sometimes encouraging careful engagement, sometimes demanding outright rejection, and this uncertainty was precisely what Pius X didn't want modern researchers to see. The consequence was that historians working on the development of Catholic intellectual life in the 19th century had to work around significant gaps in the documentary record, and many of them didn't realize the gaps existed because the classification system made it appear that what they had access to was simply everything that had survived. You're not dealing with Vatican mysteries in the sensational sense. No one was hiding evidence of supernatural events or covering up scandals involving historical figures. You're dealing with something more fundamental to how institutions manage their own legitimacy, the control of evidence about internal decision-making processes. Another layer of restriction was added during the pontificate of Benedict XV, who served from 1914 to 1922 and oversaw the Church during World War I. Benedict XV attempted to position the papacy as a neutral mediator in the conflict, issuing peace proposals and maintaining diplomatic contact with both the Allied and Central Powers. But his efforts were largely unsuccessful, and both sides viewed the Vatican with suspicion. The archival record of this period, which includes extensive correspondence between the Vatican Secretariat of State and various national governments, is partially available to researchers, but materials related to the Vatican's internal assessments of the war's progress, its private communications with specific military and political leaders, and its discussions about how to respond to atrocities reported from the front lines remain classified under codes that place them outside standard access. Some of this material was classified immediately during the war itself, under the logic that diplomatic communications needed to remain confidential to protect the Vatican's neutrality. But other materials were classified retroactively in the 1920s and 1930s, during the pontificates of Pius V and Pius X, as the Vatican reviewed its World War I correspondence and decided that certain documents could complicate its position in the increasingly tense political environment of interwar Europe. One specific example involves the Vatican's response to reports of the Armenian genocide, which took place primarily in 1915 and 1916 under the Ottoman Empire. Benedict XV received detailed reports about the mass killings of Armenians from Catholic missionaries, diplomats, and local church officials, and he issued private diplomatic protests to Ottoman authorities, but he did not make a public condemnation. Historians have long debated why Benedict XV chose this approach, with some arguing that he believed private diplomacy would be more effective, and others suggesting that he feared public condemnation would endanger Catholic communities living under Ottoman rule. The archival documentation that would allow historians to settle this debate exists. Letters from Benedict XV to his diplomatic representatives, internal memoranda discussing how to respond to the genocide reports, and correspondence with Ottoman officials, but much of it remains classified under reserved codes. A small portion was made available in the 1990s when Pope John Paul II opened certain sections of the Benedict XV archive to researchers, but the materials related specifically to the genocide debate were not included. The institutional mechanism here is a classification category that Vatican archivists refer to as diplomatic sensitivity, which applies to materials that could affect the Church's current relationships with other states or religious communities. The logic is that even if an event took place over a century ago, if the documentation could be used to criticize the Vatican's historical decisions in ways that complicate present-day diplomatic relations, it remains restricted. This creates a situation where the Vatican Archive is simultaneously one of the most open ecclesiastical archives in the world, genuinely more accessible than many national archives in terms of what it allows researchers to request, and one of the most strategically controlled because the openness itself functions as a form of misdirection, making the restrictions less visible. You're sitting in that reading room again, and you've just received a card of documents related to Vatican diplomacy during the 1920s. You spend hours going through them, taking notes, photographing pages with your personal camera under the archive's regulations. The material is rich, detailed, exactly what you need for your research. But then you come across a footnote in one document that references another file, something labeled SS 1923-47R. And when you try to request it, the archivist tells you that file is not currently available for consultation. You ask why, and the response is polite but final. That material has not yet been processed for researcher access. You accept this because you have 40 other files to work through, and your time in the archive is limited. But later, talking with other historians who've worked on similar topics, you discover that multiple people have tried to request files with that same classification pattern, SS followed by a year and a file number and the letter R, and all have received the same response. The pattern suggests not that these files are unprocessed, but that they're classified under a restriction that the archive staff has been instructed not to explain in detail. Some historians quietly disagree about how significant these restricted files actually are, with some arguing that they probably contain routine diplomatic correspondence that's been classified out of bureaucratic caution, and others suggesting that the consistency of the restriction pattern indicates something more deliberate. You're moving deeper now into the specific mechanics of how the Vatican Archive classification system operates in practice, and this requires understanding a particular reform that took place in 1924 under Pope Pius V. Pius V, who served from 1922 to 1939, was deeply concerned with modernizing the Vatican's administrative structures, and one of his priorities was reforming the archive to make it more efficient while simultaneously strengthening control over sensitive materials. In 1924, he appointed Pietro Gasparri, who was serving as Cardinal Secretary of State, to oversee a comprehensive reorganization of the archive's cataloging system. Gasparri, who had previously been involved in the codification of canon law, approached the archive with a legalistic mindset, creating a new classification structure that divided materials into 4 primary access levels: libero, free access, Ristretto, restricted access requiring special permission. Riservato, reserved, requiring explicit authorization from the prefect of the archive. And arcano, secret, requiring papal permission. This system was more transparent than previous informal arrangements because it created clear categories, but it was also more restrictive because it formalized the process of moving materials into higher levels of restriction. The physical implementation of this system involved reshelving significant portions of the archive and creating new catalog cards that indicated access levels using color-coded markers: green for libero, yellow for ristretto, red for riservato, and black for arcano. Researchers working in the archive during the 1920s and 1930s noticed that certain catalog drawers contained cards with red or black markers, but these cards were kept in separate sections of the catalog room and were not accessible to general researchers. If you were working on a topic that you suspected might touch on restricted materials, you could formally request permission to view the restricted catalog cards, but the request process itself required you to specify exactly what you were looking for, which meant you had to already know, at least in general terms, what was restricted in order to request access to the information about what was restricted. This created a circular logic that effectively prevented most researchers from ever encountering the restricted materials, not through outright denial, but through procedural complexity. One concrete example of how this system operated in practice involves research into the Vatican's financial arrangements during the 1920s and 1930s, particularly the period surrounding the Lateran Treaty of 1929, which resolved the Roman question by establishing Vatican City as an independent state and providing the papacy with financial compensation for the loss of the papal states in the 19th century. The basic facts of the Lateran Treaty are well documented. The Italian government paid the Vatican 750 million lire in cash and 1 billion lire in Italian government bonds. But the archival materials related to how the Vatican invested this money, which financial advisors it consulted, and what internal debates occurred about the appropriate use of the funds are largely classified under riservato codes. Some materials were released in the 1980s and 1990s, allowing historians to piece together parts of the story, but significant gaps remain, particularly around the Vatican's relationship with certain Italian banks and its investments in companies that had connections to the fascist government. The institutional logic for restricting this material is that it touches on the Vatican's ongoing financial operations and could be used to raise questions about the Church's financial practices in ways that might affect its current economic position. One historian who has worked extensively on Vatican finances during this period, John Pollard, has noted in several publications that key files referenced in the documents he was able to access simply weren't available for request, and that Vatican archivists told him these files were still under review, even decades after the events they documented. The consequence is that the historical understanding of how the modern Vatican's financial system was established remains incomplete based on partial documentation and inference. Another area heavily affected by the 1924 classification reform involves materials related to the Vatican's diplomatic negotiations during the rise of fascism and Nazism in Europe during the 1920s and 1930s. Pius V's pontificate saw extensive Vatican diplomatic activity as the Church attempted to navigate relationships with increasingly authoritarian governments in Italy, Germany, Spain, and elsewhere. Some of this correspondence has been released and studied extensively. The negotiations leading to the Reichskonkordat of 1933 between the Vatican and Nazi Germany, for example, are relatively well documented, but materials related to the Vatican's internal debates about how to respond to Nazi racial policies, its private communications with German Catholic leaders who were trying to resist Nazi influence, and its discussions about whether to speak out publicly against Nazi persecution of Jews and other groups remain largely restricted. This isn't speculation. Multiple historians have documented their attempts to access these materials and the consistent refusals they've received. The Vatican's position, when it has addressed these questions publicly, has been that materials from the Pius XIX period are still being processed for eventual release, and that the archive is working through a massive backlog of documents from this era. In 2019, Pope Francis announced that the archive from the pontificate of Pius X, who served from 1939 to 1958, would be open to researchers starting in 2020, which was seen as a significant step toward greater transparency about the Vatican's role during World War II. But even this opening came with restrictions. Certain files remained classified under diplomatic sensitivity categories, and materials related to the Vatican's financial operations and its intelligence-gathering activities during the war were explicitly excluded from the release. The physical structure that supports this system is located in a specific area of the archive storage facility known as the Riserva, which is a secured section that requires additional clearance beyond the normal researcher permissions. The Riserva isn't hidden. Vatican archivists acknowledge its existence, but access to it is granted on a case-by-case basis, typically only to researchers who have established long-term relationships with the archive and who are working on projects that the Vatican considers important enough to justify the additional access. One scholar who was granted access to materials in the Riserva, working on a study of papal diplomacy in the early 20th century, described the experience of being escorted by an archivist through a series of secured corridors to a small reading room where restricted materials could be consulted under direct supervision. He wasn't allowed to photograph the documents, only to take handwritten notes, and certain pages within files were marked with paper clips, indicating sections he wasn't permitted to read. When he asked about these sections, the archivist explained that they contained references to individuals who were still living or to diplomatic matters that remained sensitive. The historian accepted these conditions because having any access to restricted materials was rare enough that refusing would have meant losing the opportunity entirely. But afterward, when he attempted to publish his research, he found that certain details he'd noted from the restricted files couldn't be verified because other scholars didn't have access to the same materials, which created a methodological problem. His claims were based on documentation that couldn't be independently checked, which some reviewers felt compromised the scholarly reliability of his work. This is one of the subtle ways the restriction system shapes historical knowledge, not by preventing information from being known, but by preventing it from being verified and integrated into the broader scholarly consensus. Some historians quietly disagree about whether the Vatican's restriction system is significantly different from the classification systems used by national governments for diplomatic and intelligence materials, noting that most countries restrict access to sensitive government documents for many decades, sometimes permanently. But the difference, other historians argue, is that the Vatican archive holds materials that aren't just governmental, but also religious and moral in nature. Documentation of an institution that claims moral authority and that many people look to for ethical guidance, which creates a different standard for transparency than applies to ordinary state archives. You're now confronting the question of what happens when researchers become aware that specific documents exist. They find references in other materials. They see them cited in older scholarship. They know the file numbers, but discover those documents have been reclassified in ways that make them unrequestable. This situation became particularly apparent during the 1990s and 2000s, when the Vatican opened sections of the archive covering the pontificate of Pius V, and researchers working on the Church's relationship with fascism and Nazism began to notice systematic gaps. One of the most discussed cases involves materials related to the Vatican's response to the persecution of Jews in Germany and occupied territories during the 1930s and early 1940s. The Vatican archive contains extensive correspondence from this period, including letters from Catholic bishops in Germany, reports from papal nuncios in various European countries, and internal Vatican memoranda discussing how to respond to increasing evidence of Nazi atrocities. Some of this correspondence has been published in multi-volume collections edited by Vatican archivists, most notably the 11-volume series Actes et Documents du Saint-Siège, relatif à la Seconde Guerre mondiale, published between 1965 and 1981, which presented selected documents related to the Vatican's wartime activities. But historians who have worked with these published volumes have noted that the selection was carefully curated and that the footnotes and internal references in the published documents point to many other files that were not included and that remain classified. One specific example involves the Vatican's knowledge of the Holocaust as it was occurring. The published volumes show that the Vatican received reports about mass killings of Jews as early as 1941 and 1942, and that Pius X issued some private diplomatic protests, but they don't include the full range of information the Vatican possessed or the complete internal discussions about how to respond. In 2020, when portions of the Pius X archive were opened, researchers immediately began requesting files related to this question, and while some significant materials were made available, others remained restricted under codes that indicated ongoing diplomatic sensitivity. One file that multiple historians have tried to access is labeled SSRRRAA 1942-43E8. Which, based on the classification system, appears to be materials from the Secretariat of State, Relations with States Division, from 1942-43, and the number 8 typically indicates files related to Germany and occupied territories. References to this file appear in several other documents that are available, specifically in correspondence where Vatican officials mention having received detailed reports about conditions in concentration camps and discussing whether to make a public statement. But when researchers request SSRR.AA 1942-43-8, they're told it's still under review and not available for consultation. The institutional mechanism that allows this restriction to continue is that the Vatican Archives access policy includes a provision stating that materials can remain temporarily restricted if their release would cause grave damage to living persons or to the Church's diplomatic relations, and this provision has no fixed time limit. Because the Vatican maintains diplomatic relations with many of the countries involved in World War II, and because questions about the Church's response to the Holocaust remain politically and religiously sensitive in those countries, materials that document the Vatican's internal decision-making process during the war can be kept restricted indefinitely under this provision. The consequence is that historical debates about Pius X's actions during the Holocaust continue to be argued, based on incomplete evidence, with defenders of Pius X pointing to the documents that are available to argue that he did what was possible under difficult circumstances, and critics arguing that the restrictions themselves suggest the Vatican is hiding evidence of greater inaction or complicity than has been acknowledged. Neither side can definitively prove its case because the most direct evidence remains inaccessible. Some historians quietly disagree about whether the restricted files would actually resolve the debate, with some suggesting that the Vatican may be overestimating the sensitivity of the materials and that releasing them might actually strengthen the Church's historical position by showing more clearly the constraints Pius X was operating under. But as long as the materials remain restricted, the disagreement itself becomes part of the historical narrative, shaping public understanding of this period in ways that the actual documents might not if they were fully available. You're beginning to see that the classification system creates a kind of historical limbo where certain events are neither fully known nor completely unknown. And this ambiguity serves institutional interests by allowing different interpretations to coexist without being definitively resolved. Another area where this dynamic is visible involves materials related to the Vatican's financial operations during and after World War II, particularly its relationship with the Institute for the Works of Religion, commonly known as the Vatican Bank, which was formally established in 1942. The Vatican Bank has been involved in numerous financial scandals over the decades, most notoriously in the early 1980s, with the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano and the death of Roberto Calvi, the bank's chairman, who was found hanging from Blackfriars Bridge in London in 1982. The archival materials related to the Vatican Bank's founding, its early operations, and its relationship with Italian and international financial institutions during the 1940s and 1950s are classified under codes that place them in the riservato category, requiring special permission that is rarely granted. Researchers who have studied Vatican finances during this period have had to work primarily with external sources, Italian banking records, government financial reports, journalistic investigations, rather than with the Vatican's own internal documentation. This creates a situation where the financial history of one of the world's most influential religious institutions is written primarily from outside sources, which may be accurate but which lack the internal perspective that the Vatican's own records would provide. One historian who specializes in Vatican finances, Gianluigi Nuzzi, gained access to some restricted Vatican financial documents through leaks in the 2010s. And he published them in books that caused significant controversy within the Church. The documents he published showed internal Vatican discussions about financial mismanagement, conflicts between different Vatican departments over budget control, and concerns about transparency that contradicted the Vatican's public statements about its financial reforms. The Vatican's response was to prosecute the individuals who had leaked the documents and to reinforce restrictions on access to financial materials in the archive, arguing that financial records required protection to prevent their misuse. The physical mechanism for this involved moving additional materials into the Arcano classification, the highest level of restriction which requires specific papal authorization to access. The consequence is that while historians can study the Vatican's theological developments, its diplomatic activities, and its organizational evolution with substantial archival access, its financial operations remain largely opaque, known primarily through crisis moments when information becomes public through scandal or investigation rather than through systematic historical research. This asymmetry in access shapes the kind of history that can be written about the modern Vatican, allowing detailed studies of its religious and diplomatic roles while leaving its economic dimensions much less understood. You're recognizing that the classification system isn't just about protecting sensitive information. It's about shaping which aspects of Vatican history become the subject of scholarly consensus and which remain contested and ambiguous. The system succeeds not by completely preventing information from being known, but by controlling the conditions under which information becomes historically authoritative, which requires access to the primary sources that allow claims to be verified and integrated into the scholarly record. You're deep enough into the archive's operational logic now that you can see how specific types of historical questions become systematically difficult to answer, not because evidence doesn't exist, but because the classification system fragments that evidence across different access levels in ways that prevent comprehensive research. One category that demonstrates this particularly clearly involves materials related to the process of making saints, the formal investigations, witness testimonies, medical examinations, and theological assessments that the Vatican conducts before declaring someone a saint through canonization. The Congregation for the Causes of Saints, which manages this process, maintains its own archive, separate from the main Vatican Apostolic Archive. But materials from canonization investigations eventually transfer to the Central Archive after a case is completed, usually several decades after the canonization itself. In theory, these materials become available to researchers once they're transferred. But in practice, many canonization files remain restricted because they contain testimony about living individuals, medical records that raise privacy concerns, or theological assessments that touch on controversial doctrinal questions. The physical system for this involves a separate storage area within the archive structure, sometimes called the Fondo Congregazione, which houses materials from various Vatican congregations, including the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. Access to this fondo requires separate permission beyond the standard researcher credentials, and even when permission is granted, specific files within canonization cases can be withheld if they're deemed too sensitive. One concrete example involves the canonization of Pius IX, the 19th century pope whose reign saw the loss of the Papal States and who issued the Syllabus of Errors in 1864, condemning many aspects of modern liberal thought, and who convened the First Vatican Council, which declared papal infallibility as Catholic dogma. Pius IX was beatified in 2000 by Pope John Paul II, the step before full canonization, in a ceremony that was controversial because of Pius IX's historical association with anti-liberal and, according to some historians, anti-Semitic positions. The archival materials related to Pius IX's beatification process, which began in the 1950s and continued for decades, include extensive historical research into his actions and decisions, testimony from historians and theologians about his legacy, and internal Vatican discussions about whether his beatification would cause more harm than good given the controversies surrounding him. These materials would be invaluable for historians studying how the modern Vatican engages with its own difficult history and how it makes decisions about which historical figures to elevate, despite their controversial aspects. But the canonization files for Pius IX remain classified under riservato codes, accessible only to researchers who can demonstrate a specific scholarly need and who receive explicit permission from both the prefect of the archive and the prefect of the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. One scholar who attempted to access these files in the early 2000s, working on a study of 19th century papal history, was granted permission to view some materials, but was told that testimony from specific witnesses and internal Vatican memoranda about the controversies surrounding the beatification were not available because they could affect living persons and ongoing church relations with Jewish communities. The consequence is that the historical understanding of how the Vatican makes decisions about honoring controversial figures from its past remains based on public statements and external analysis rather than on the full internal, deliberative record. Another category of systematically restricted material involves Vatican intelligence gathering activities, particularly during the Cold War period from the 1940s through the 1980s. The Vatican, through its global network of bishops, priests, and religious orders, possessed one of the most extensive intelligence collection capabilities of any international institution, particularly in communist countries where the Church maintained underground networks of believers. The Vatican used this intelligence both to protect Catholic communities under persecution and to provide information to Western governments, particularly the United States, about conditions behind the Iron Curtain. The archival documentation of these activities, reports from bishops in communist countries, Vatican assessments of political developments in Eastern Europe, correspondence with intelligence agencies from various Western countries, is classified under codes that indicate ongoing diplomatic and security sensitivity. The institutional mechanism here is a classification category called Affari Esteri Riservati, Reserved Foreign Affairs, which applies to materials that the Secretariat of State determines could affect current diplomatic relations or reveal intelligence gathering methods that might still be in use. Because the Vatican continues to operate in countries with authoritarian governments and continues to maintain networks of information gathering through its church hierarchy, materials that would reveal how these networks operated historically remain restricted to protect current operations. One specific case that illustrates this involves the Vatican's role in supporting Solidarity, the Polish labor movement that eventually contributed to the collapse of communist rule in Poland in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Pope John Paul II, who was Polish and who was elected in 1978, maintained close communication with Solidarity leaders and with Catholic activists in Poland, and the Vatican provided financial support, communication channels, and diplomatic protection for the movement. The basic facts of this support are acknowledged and have been written about extensively, including by participants in the events, but the archival materials that would show the full extent of Vatican involvement how much money was transferred, which specific operations were supported, what communication methods were used, and how the Vatican coordinated with Western intelligence agencies like the CIA remain largely classified. Small portions were released in the 2000s and 2010s, allowing historians to confirm some details, but files specifically related to financial transfers and intelligence coordination are classified under arcano codes that require papal authorization to access. One historian who has worked on this topic, John Kohler, has argued based on the materials that are available and on interviews with participants that the Vatican's role was more extensive than has been publicly acknowledged, effectively functioning as a covert supporter of anti-communist resistance throughout Eastern Europe during the 1980s. But without access to the full archival record, these claims remain in the category of informed speculation rather than documented history. The physical location where these materials are stored is believed to be in a particularly secured section of the archive, possibly in underground storage areas beneath the Cortile della Pina, though the exact layout of the archive's restricted storage areas isn't publicly documented. Researchers who have worked in the archive for many years report that there are corridors and doorways marked with simple signs reading accesso riservato, reserved access, that lead to areas where they're not permitted. And archival staff don't discuss what's stored in these sections. This isn't dramatically mysterious. Many archives have secured storage areas for sensitive materials, but it's a reminder that the physical organization of the archive reinforces the classification system, creating spaces that are literally off-limits to most researchers. Your understanding that the Vatican Archive operates as a complex system where transparency and restriction coexist, with the transparency functioning partly to legitimize the institution's claim to openness, while the restrictions ensure that certain types of questions remain difficult to answer with archival certainty. The system works because it's procedural and bureaucratic rather than melodramatic, because it provides enough access to satisfy most researchers while maintaining control over the materials that would be most revealing about the Vatican's internal decision-making processes during its most difficult historical moments. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this level of restriction is justified, with some arguing that the Vatican, as a religious institution rather than a conventional state, has a legitimate interest in protecting materials that could be misused to attack the Church unfairly, and others arguing that precisely because the Vatican claims moral authority and asks for trust from its followers, it has an obligation to be more transparent about its history, including its mistakes and compromises, than secular institutions might be. You've reached the point where the specifics accumulate into a pattern, and the pattern reveals something about how institutional memory operates when it's subject to careful control. The Vatican Archive classification system, as it exists in 2026, is the product of more than a century of refinement, from Leo III's opening in 1881 through the various reorganizations under Pius X, Pius V, and their successors, up to Pope Francis's renaming and partial opening of the Pius XV materials in 2019 and 2020. Each of these moments added layers to the system, creating a structure that can appear open and accessible while maintaining significant areas of restriction that are difficult for outsiders to fully map or understand. The current access system, as detailed in the Archive's official regulations published on the Vatican website, specifies that materials are generally available up to the end of the pontificate of Pius XIV in 1958, with materials from John XXIII, 1958-1963, available by special request, and materials from Paul VI, 1963 to 1978, and later popes requiring exceptional permission. But within the pre-1958 materials that are theoretically open, there remain numerous classification codes that place specific files into restricted categories. The most common of these codes are AA, Archivio Arcano, RIS, Riservato, SS, with an R suffix, Secretariat of State Reserved, AES-RR, Affairs of the Church Reserved Relations, and SCO-JR, Sacred Congregations Reserved. Each of these indicates a different type of restriction based on content rather than simply date, which means that two files from the same year dealing with similar topics might have completely different access levels based on judgments about sensitivity that were made by archivists decades ago and that may or may not still reflect current concerns. One concrete example of how this creates research obstacles involves historians working on the Second Vatican Council, which took place from 1962 to 1965 under John XXIII, and Paul VI, and which represented the most significant internal reform of the Catholic Church in the 20th century. The Vatican has released enormous amounts of material related to the Council: working documents, draft texts, voting records, correspondence between bishops who participated. And this has enabled detailed historical study of how the Council's reforms were debated and decided. But materials related to the internal Vatican discussions that happened before the Council, during the preparatory period when decisions were made about which topics would be open for discussion and which would be off limits, remain partially restricted. Specifically, files related to the decision not to include certain controversial topics, questions about clerical celibacy, the role of women in church governance, the Church's approach to contraception, as formal agenda items for the Council are classified under SSR codes that place them in the riservato category. These restrictions mean that historians can study in detail what was discussed at the Council, but have much less access to the documentation of what was deliberately excluded from discussion, which shapes understanding of the Council's significance. One historian, John O'Malley, has written extensively about Vatican II and has noted in his work that certain questions about the Council's preparatory phase remain difficult to answer with archival evidence, requiring instead reliance on memoirs of participants and on inference from the gaps in the available documentation. The institutional logic for maintaining these restrictions appears to be that the excluded topics remain controversial within the Church today. Debates about celibacy and women's roles continue to generate discussion, and making available the documentation of how they were excluded in the 1960s might strengthen the position of those who advocate for reopening these questions. The consequence is that the history of Vatican II, perhaps the most studied moment in modern Catholic history, remains incomplete in specific ways that relate to ongoing tensions within the Church. Another area where the classification system's effects are visible involves materials related to clergy sexual abuse cases. The Vatican has maintained files on reports of sexual abuse by clergy for many decades, with these files held by various Vatican departments, including the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which handles discipline of clergy who violate church law. These files document when the Vatican first learned of specific abuse cases, how it responded, what instructions it gave to local bishops, and what decisions were made about removing or protecting accused clergy. The existence of these files became public knowledge primarily through legal proceedings in various countries, where subpoenas compelled the production of documents showing that the Vatican had been informed about abusive clergy much earlier than it had publicly acknowledged. The Vatican's position has been that these files are classified under the highest levels of restriction because they contain sensitive personal information about both victims and accused clergy, and that releasing them would violate privacy protections and could interfere with ongoing legal proceedings. But this classification has the effect of making it very difficult for historians to study how the Church's institutional response to clergy abuse developed over time, what officials knew when, and what the decision-making processes were that led to protective responses rather than punitive ones in many cases. Some files related to older abuse cases from the mid-20th century have begun to be released as part of legal settlements or through special permissions granted to researchers working on church reform, but the bulk of the material remains classified under Arcano codes. The physical organization of these files is separate from the main archive structure. They're held in the offices of the relevant congregations rather than in the central archive building, which means they're subject to different regulations and aren't covered by the general access policies that apply to historical materials. This institutional separation is itself a form of classification, placing certain types of records outside the framework where historical research normally operates. One researcher who has studied the available materials on clergy abuse cases from the 1950s and 1960s, which were released through legal proceedings, noted that the files show a consistent pattern of the Vatican prioritizing the protection of the Church's reputation over the safety of potential victims, but that the sample of available files is small enough that it's difficult to know whether this pattern was universal or whether there were cases where different approaches were taken. The lack of systematic access to the full archival record prevents this question from being answered with historical confidence. You're seeing now that the Vatican Archive classification system functions not as a simple wall between available and restricted information, but as a complex filtering mechanism that shapes which questions can be answered with archival authority and which remain in the realm of incomplete knowledge. The system succeeds because it operates through procedural mechanisms rather than dramatic secrecy, because it provides substantial, genuine access that makes the institution appear transparent while maintaining strategic control over materials that would be most revealing about controversial decisions, financial operations, and institutional failures. The real consequence isn't that these things remain completely unknown. Many of them are known through external sources, legal proceedings, journalistic investigations, and the testimony of participants, but that they remain outside the framework of archival-based historical consensus, which means they can be contested and debated indefinitely, rather than becoming settled historical understanding. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this outcome is intentional or is simply the result of an institution being cautious about opening materials that might be misunderstood or misused. But the effect is the same either way. Certain aspects of Vatican history remain permanently provisional, subject to revision, if and when materials are released, but never reaching the kind of documented certainty that archival research normally provides. The Vatican Archive will likely continue to open materials gradually. Pope Francis has indicated willingness to continue the pattern of releasing pontifical materials after sufficient time has passed, but the classification system itself is likely to remain in place, creating new categories of restricted materials even as older ones are slowly released. This means that the gap between what's archived and what's accessible will persist, maintained not through denial or suppression, but through the bureaucratic logic of an institution managing its own complex history. And that's where we are tonight, sitting with the understanding that the most effective forms of institutional silence aren't the dramatic ones, locked vaults and forbidden knowledge, but the procedural ones, the catalog codes that don't appear in the public index, the files that are still under review, the permissions that require special circumstances that are never quite met. If you found value in this kind of detailed investigation into how historical knowledge gets shaped by the systems that control access to evidence, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video. It helps others who are interested in these questions find their way here. And if you're someone who appreciates these late-night examinations of how institutions work beneath their public faces, consider subscribing to Tales of Vatican Secrets. We share new investigations like this every day, looking at the real systems, the documented mechanisms, the specific ways that history becomes known or stays hidden. Thank you for listening this late into the night. I hope you rest well wherever you are.